3:49. So, Brandon, you're teed up. You're already set up, so you can put slides if you want, if you're ready.
Alrighty.
And you can start whenever you like. Thank you for talking.
Hey, can you guys all see my slides here?
No.
No.
Did you set the application thing to share it?
Hang on. How about
there
now?
It goes. There it goes.
Okay. Just a heads up, I'm going to be keeping the Discord off screen while I'm talking, because otherwise I will have an aneurysm.
All right. We'll catch it up on Q&A.
Okay. So hi, just to briefly introduce myself, my name is Brandon Carbaugh. I am a junior writer at Pixelberry Studios. We work on a mobile game called Choices, Stories You Play. That's kind of a platform that contains a bunch of visual novels within it that release weekly and episodic. I've worked on games including The Crown and the Flame, which is sort of a fantasy Dragon Age kind of thing, and It Lives in the Woods, which is a game that is currently coming out. That's like a horror game. I'm kind of new to like the visual novel community, but I'm excited to be here, and some of these talks have been like very, very interesting. So what we're going to talk about today is the player-character relationship, which is a narrative design and writing question. And before we get into it, I just want to say that like any writing-related rules, this is just my perspective. It's ways that I think about some of this stuff, and that maybe it will be useful to you when you're troubleshooting issues with your story, but it is by no means like the one right way. So the player-character relationship is essentially the question of who is the game's main character, what is their relationship to the player, and how is that relationship communicated? It's an important question to ask and understand because it's kind of inevitable. Every moment in your game comments on who the main character is, what their identity is, how they relate to the player, what aspects of their life the player has control over, and you have to understand it and try to get a hold on it, or it will sneak up behind you and clobber you in the back of the head. It's also good to understand because when a player and character are in sync, it helps your game shine, and it helps very emotional scenes come through the way they're supposed to. And when they're not, it can totally undermine it. One line that screws up your player's expectation of what their agency is can totally throw off the rest of a scene. So what is the player-character relationship? When we talk about characters in video games, we tend to oversimplify, I think, how we describe main characters in video games. So we kind of lump everything into big boxes where we have like silent protagonists like Link and something everyone else, and that it's not the most useful from a writing perspective, and there's a lot of hazy gray area in the middle, like characters like BioWare characters like Commander Shepard, that they kind of represent you, but they are also kind of a predefined character in their own right. So it's important to talk about the ways that main character's identity is presented, and the first way is acknowledging that characters are more complex than simple boxes like that. Characters are more complex than just their backstory. The way that you present your game's main character to your player is not like a one and done thing in the opening. It's something that happens over and over throughout the story, and you're constantly sort of touching base to remind them, here's who this character is, and here's who they are in relation to you, the player. It's especially important in visual novels, I think, because visual novels are so based around those moments of choices, those decisions when there's 3 options on the screen and you have to pick one. And the context that comes before those decisions and the reaction that comes after those decisions is really, I mean, it's kind of everything that makes those choices actually impactful. And if your player and their character are not on the same page, all kinds of wacky stuff happens. So understanding how this works it's sort of crucial to conveying subjective point of view in games as a storytelling medium. So to kind of visualize this, I'm going to go to my very crappy visual aid, and we had a bunch of other talks where people had big elaborate 3D models, but I've got this. So basically the way that I think about this stuff is like two intersecting axes. So on the horizontal axis, we have the axis of definition, and this goes from characters who are predefined, like like the main character in a Final Fantasy game, somebody who's fully formed and already has an identity, to characters who are player defined, like the main character in an Elder Scrolls game, who is sort of a proxy for the player themselves. The vertical axis is what I think of as the axis of interaction. And this is a way of thinking about any given moment in a game. In a visual novel, this could be either a choice or the stuff that comes before or after, and whether its role is to tell the player, here's the kind of character you are, or give them the opportunity to answer the question, like, what kind of character do you want to be? So to kind of break these down a little more, the axis of definition asks, is this a character the player steps into, one that they embody, or one that embodies them, or is it somewhere in between? The axis of interaction asks, does this moment tell you to act a certain way, or does it ask you, does it present you with a situation and say, hey, how do you want to handle this? One second. So what are some of the ways that the axis of definition works, that we convey main character's identity to the player, and that the player can help shape a main character's identity? And this is kind of basic storytelling stuff, but just to touch base on it real quick. Backstory is obviously one of them. So when you play BioWare, or when you play a BioWare game like Mass Effect, you have a couple different backstories you can pick from. And that's an example of like player expression, but they're also sort of predefined backstories. So you can pick one that's like, I'm a veteran and I survived a big battle where a bunch of people died, and there's dialogue that branches depending on that. Another way you can do this is visual identity, which of course is very important in visual novels. There's a lot you can convey about a character just through their design, and at the same time, letting a player customize a character's design can go a long way towards giving them a sense of ownership. It's kind of the reason most RPGs have character customization, because it's a very good way to let somebody feel like they're inhabiting another person. UI and other things like that give you a subjective view of the world, and my favorite example here is the Batman games. So like when you play Batman Arkham Asylum, you see the world as Batman. You see enemies through walls. You can tell where sound is. You have radio chatter from like thugs on the street. It does a very good job of giving you like the entire perceptual framework that Batman has as a person to make you feel like him. And the last way, it's kind of coming from that, is just moments and experiences that make you feel like a person, or give you the chance to express who you are and who you want to be. The axis of interaction is kind of like the axis of definition actually being implemented. It's how is all of that stuff conveyed, received, interpreted, and sort of put into effect on a moment-to-moment basis. And I break these down into two kinds of moments. The first is instructive moments. And instructive moments tell the player, they say, here's who your character is, here are your areas of input. So for example, if you start a game and you're introduced to the main character and it says, what's your name? That's an area you get to control. If the very first line of dialogue is, you're sitting at a table eating a pizza, it is now a default part of that character's identity that he's somebody who eats pizza. And that's not something the player gets to have agency over. And that if a silly little example, but it has a way of ballooning up in ways that you don't expect. And the littlest thing can really irritate players. Especially when it comes to romance, a character flirting with someone that the player doesn't want to in those kind of visual novels can be very dicey. This brings us to the second, which is expressive moments. And I think I called these exploratory on a previous slide because I don't have my act together. But basically, expressive moments are moments like in Elder Scrolls where, so for example, in Elder Scrolls, you can pick up a bow and you fire the bow and boop, you get an archery point. And if you do that enough times, the game says, hey, you're an archer. And all of a sudden there's characters have dialogue that branches off of that and things like that. Expressive moments are asking the player who they are, who they want to be, how they want to express themselves within the game world, and then acknowledging the thing they say and reflecting it back to them in a way that either is meaningful or at least feels meaningful. When these things work together, when you feel that you embody a character, when you feel that a game is like giving you the options you want it to give you and acknowledging the choices you've made, that's a good feeling, and I think it's something we should strive for. And it's what I call player-character harmony. It's essentially when you and the character are in one-to-one sync. You know, you're playing Batman, you feel like Batman, or you're playing Elder Scrolls, and you feel like, you know, the Archmage of Winterhold. You feel like the Archmage of Winterhold or whoever, and feel like the game is really acknowledging the role and the character you've built. And really importantly, you understand what things you have control over and what things you don't as far as that character's identity, and everything just sort of works. So I think harmony is good, and I think as a rule, generally you should strive for it. However, there are exceptions to that, which I'll get to after the next slide. But for the most part, I think in the same way that like a prose novelist wants to make a character empathetic or likable, if you want to use that word, a writer for games, you should strive for player character harmony like most of the time, because its absence is weird, and when it's removed suddenly, it can really ruin a game. So that brings us to the big scary monster in the room, which is player character dissonance. And that's when a player and their character are not on the same page. So this might be like if you're playing a really intense action-y first-person shooter, and all of a sudden they throw like a shitty stealth section at you and you feel ripped right out of the game. Or you're playing a big open-ended game like Elder Scrolls and you meet a character you hate and you're like, I hate this guy, I just want to punch him in the face. And there's no reason you can't, but the game just won't let you. It doesn't give you the option. Or you're playing a Batman game and just for whatever reason, some section of the game is failing. You don't feel like Batman. You're not on the same page as the character. Or you're playing a game like Mass Effect, and maybe Commander Shepard does something you don't want him to do because you're under the assumption that this is your character you can control and pilot, and then like maybe Commander Shepard shoots somebody in the face and you didn't get to decide, and that feels really weird and jarring. I think overall this results from it comes from inconsistency. You know, players will accept a lot of different kinds of relationships between themselves and their characters, and different moments can treat that relationship different ways. But player character dissonance happens when it changes really suddenly, without warning, without context that makes them understand why that's happening. In a lot of ways, I think it's pretty hard to avoid, because it's kind of it's like the default that a piece of game writing wants to go to. Like Stephen Hawking has this quote in, I think it's A Brief History of Time, where he says that there are infinite ways that a teacup can be broken, and there's only one way it can be whole. And I think the player character relationship is a lot like that. There's a million ways it can go wrong, and there's only one way that it can be right and feel consistent and not ever like unexpectedly surprise the player. And most of the time you're never going to reach that, but your job as a writer is to try to push as close to that as you possibly can. That said, there are times when it's okay to when player character dissonance is like a thing you want to go for. So like anything, like a lot of times you'll see this used as a metaphor for conflict within the character's own mind. So I'm thinking of like Would You Kindly from BioShock, or that moment in Final Fantasy VII where right before Sephiroth kills Eris, spoilers, but there's a moment right before that where Cloud is holding his sword poised above Eris's head, and every button you press on the controller makes him raise it a little higher, and it's like the exact opposite of what you want, and it's meant to convey that like Cloud is in a very like screwed up mental state at that moment, and that can be really good and effective. It just you don't want it to happen by accident. If you really want to see a game do that very well, check out Ninja Theory's Hellblade that just came out a little while ago. That is probably one of my favorite games of last year, but that whole game is built around dissonance between the player and the character and different voices in the character's head, and it's very well done. This is a thing that if you write horror games, you should think about and try to learn how to kind of weaponize it, because I think it can be useful. So that pretty much brings me to the end of my talk here. Overall, I think the player character relationship is something you have to understand because it's inevitable. It's constantly going to pop up. And if you don't get a handle on it, it will sort itself out and it will try to ruin the rest of your game. So think about it when you're writing. Try to keep it consistent, except when it's supposed to not be consistent, and just keep it in mind, especially right before and right after you present the player a choice. So that about wraps it up for me. If there's time for questions, we could field questions.
Got a few. That was an awesome talk.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, my favorite visual novel example of this thing is actually School Days, which if you analyze it, it's a rabbit hole. But the hilarious part is like it portrays itself as a typical game where you feel like you have agency over Makoto, right? And you're making choices. And he inevitably is written such that he will betray whatever choice you make. You're like, I want this character to go with this girl. He will go, no matter what you do, he will wind up with another girl at least partway through the scenario. It is designed to piss you off, and it does it very well.
Like the opposite example of that, of it being like the worst possible example I can think of dissonance that I really hesitate to call out a specific game, but it's the one that always comes to my mind, is the ending of Mass Effect 3. That like a lot of people, even if you like it, a lot of players felt very confused and surprised by like, this isn't what I thought my level of agency over Shepard was, and it ruined the game. Like those 5 minutes ruined an entire trilogy for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's just why. Anytime someone goes why,
I personally like those games and can forgive them those last 5 minutes, because making games is really hard. But yeah, like I understand why that annoyed a lot of people. I haven't been watching the Discord, so is there any particular
one person asked, like, how would you handle if you're able to control multiple characters? Like, how do you make that feel okay?
It's kind of a similar, you have to be more careful about establishing what amount of control you have over each character. So for example, if I were to play, like, we're talking about like BioWare games. If you were to play like a spin-off mission where you control Tally or somebody like that, you're probably not going to have the same level of control over her life. Like you're not going to be able to choose who she romances and things like that, which is fine, but that's information you have to contextualize for the player. You basically need to think about it's like every player character has their own relationship with the player, and to make it, or they either all have to be the same, or each one needs to get the same amount of attention. Because that is a good way if you know to accidentally stumble into some dissonances. If you have a character who works one way and then you jump to another character and it's totally different, but you don't explain that to the player. Any other questions?
All right. Well, we're running out of time.
Okay.
So we'll continue that on Discord, and I'm going to give Echo Frost presenter mode. And
So much
you can get
power.
set up.
Thank you all.
Uh-oh.
Yep. Thank you. All right, you guys can start whenever you're ready, and we will just type up a storm.